Welcome back to the deep dive, everybody. Today we're going to be looking at something pretty fascinating, at least I think so. It's this idea of the liminal being.
Yeah, it's really cool. It kind of helps make sense of those weird in-between states, right? The
Yeah.
ones that like defy simple explanation, like in those old myths or even in modern stories.
Exactly, yeah. And it comes up like all over the place, right? Like you see it in mythology and literature, sure, but also in psychology, even in how we think about the digital world these days based on the sources you sent over.
Yeah, definitely pops up everywhere. And it can be like really insightful, like it helps us understand how change happens, whether it's like personal change or like bigger societal shifts.
Okay, so let's break this down, right? Where does this whole idea of liminality, where does that come from? Like where did it start?
Well, the foundation really comes from this anthropologist, Arnold van Gennep. Back in like 1909, he wrote this book, The Rites of Passage. He was looking at all these different rituals like, initiations or weddings, stuff like that. And he noticed a pattern, a three-stage process.
A three-stage
Yeah,
process.
first there's separation, where you leave your old status behind, like literally or symbolically. Then there's incorporation, where you like fully enter the new status. And in the middle, well, that's where the magic happens. That's the liminal phase.
Ah, so liminality, that's like that weird space between what you were and what you're gonna be.
Exactly, yeah. Van Gennep called it like an undefined threshold.
Yeah.
You're not one thing, but you're not the other yet either. Like you're in between breaths, kind of suspended.
Huh. That's a great way to put it. Now, one of your sources talks about this other anthropologist, Victor Turner, who took this idea and ran with it. How did he build on Van Gennep's work?
Oh yeah, Turner, he took this idea of liminality and like blew it wide open. He saw it not just in individual rituals, but also in like wider cultural stuff, like think about pilgrimages, revolutions, even like carnivals. It's all about this in-between time.
So like times of big change and upheaval.
Yeah, exactly. And he also talked about this sense of communitas that emerges in liminal times. Like people in that in-between space, they kind of like bond together. There's this feeling of shared humanity and equality, which can be really powerful for driving change. I mean, you see it in history all the time. He also really focused on liminal beings, those who, for whatever reason, get stuck in that transition space.
That's so interesting that idea of finding connection and the uncertainty. Okay, so we've got this idea of liminality, but what makes a being liminal? Like what are the defining characteristics here?
Well, one of the biggest ones is this idea of existing between realities, right? Like
Yeah.
they don't fit neatly into the boxes we normally use. It's like take ghosts, for example. They're not alive, but they're not totally gone either.
Yeah, yeah, they're somewhere in between. They're like defying the whole life and death binary.
Exactly. And that's what makes them so fascinating, so unsettling,
Yeah.
right? And that kind of leads into another key characteristic, outsider status. Liminal beings, they often end up on the fringes of society because they don't like conform to the usual category.
Yeah, I guess they don't quite belong anywhere, do they?
Nope, they're always kind of on the outside looking in. And that outsider status often goes hand in hand with shape-shifting and fluid identity, like, think about those trickster gods who can change their form at will.
Right, right. Or those creatures from mythology that are like part human, part animal. They never really fit in one category, do they?
No, they straddle those boundaries. And, all of this ambiguity, it can create this sense of unease, right? Like your sources talk about uncertainty and discomfort. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think it's because, like, as humans, we crave order, right? We want to be able to categorize things to make sense of the world. But liminal beings, they mess with that. They show us that those lines, those boundaries, they're not always so clear cut.
Absolutely. They kind of expose the cracks in our systems of understanding. And it can be pretty unsettling, especially for people who, really cling to those rigid categories. But here's the thing. Liminal beings, they can also be mediators of change.
Oh, how so?
Well, because they're in between, they can act as bridges. They can help us move between different states or realms. Like think about those shamans who can communicate with the spirit world.
Right, they're like translators between those two worlds, the seen and the unseen.
Exactly. So even though they might make us uncomfortable, they can also be really important for growth and transformation.
Huh.
Okay, so we've talked about the theory, but let's get into some specific examples. Like where do we see liminal beings pop up, in mythology, literature, that kind of thing?
Well, like we already mentioned ghosts, but your source material was full of examples. There's Hermes in Greek mythology, for example.
Ah, yes, Hermes. He's a classic liminal figure. He's the messenger god, the god of boundaries, travelers, all that. What makes him so liminal, in your opinion?
Well, he's always moving between worlds, right? Like Olympus, Earth, the underworld. He never really stays in one place.
Exactly. He's constantly crossing thresholds. And then there's Anubis in Egyptian mythology.
With the jackal head.
Yeah, that's him. What's his deal, according to the stuff you've been reading?
He's the god of the dead, right? Like he oversees mummification and guides souls to the afterlife. He's literally standing at the doorway between life and death.
Totally. And those are just a couple of examples from mythology. There are tons more, like shamans and spirit walkers in various cultures.
Yeah, those figures who can like travel between the spirit world and the human world, they're super liminal too. Okay, so what about literature? Like fiction. Where do we see these ideas popping up there?
Oh man, there are so many examples. Like, let's start with Gregor Samsa from Kafka's Metamorphosis. You've read that one, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's pretty messed up, but also brilliant. Like Gregor, he wakes up one morning and he's turned into a giant bug.
Right. And it's not just his body that changes. He still has his human consciousness, but he can't communicate with his family anymore. It's like he's trapped in this horrible in-between state. What kind of impact do you think that has on the story?
Well, it creates this profound sense of isolation and this breakdown in communication. Like his family, they can't understand him. They're horrified by him, but he's not just an insect either. He's still like emotionally and intellectually human.
Exactly. And it raises all these questions about identity,
Yeah.
what it means to be human. And then you've got the ghost in Shakespeare's Hamlet. It's another classic liminal figure.
Yeah, the ghost is stuck between worlds too, right?
Yeah.
It's dead, but it can't move on.
Right. It's this unresolved presence.
Yeah.
And its liminal status drives the entire play. It comes back seeking revenge, and it forces Hamlet to confront all these big questions about life, death, morality.
So the ghost is like it's like a catalyst for all this drama and introspection. And what about something a little more modern or at least more whimsical, like Chihiro from the movie Spirited Away?
Oh yeah, Spirited Away. Love that movie.
Chihiro, she's a kid who finds herself in this magical spirit world, right? How does her being in between these two worlds, how does that shape her journey?
Well, it forces her to grow up,
Yeah.
right? Like she has to adapt to the rules of the spirit world. She has to learn to be brave, to be resourceful. And it's through that process, that liminal experience, that she discovers who she really is.
Yeah, it's like that in-between space, it's where the real transformation happens. So it seems like these fictional liminal beings, they're often at the heart of these stories about change and growth.
Definitely. And, these ideas, they're not limited to fiction. We see liminality playing out in real life all the time, too. Like, think about adolescence, right? That's a classic example of liminality in action.
Totally. Teenagers, they're not kids anymore, but they're not quite adults either. They're stuck in this awkward in between.
Exactly. And that liminality comes with all sorts of challenges, right? Like uncertainty about identity, fluctuating emotions, trying to figure out where you fit in.
Yeah, it's a time of huge change and upheaval, both internally and externally, and it's definitely uncomfortable, but it's also like necessary, right?
Yeah.
It's part of growing up.
Absolutely. It's a crucial stage in the journey toward adulthood.
Mm-hmm.
And, another example of liminality in real life is migrants and exiles.
Right, those who are like caught between two cultures.
Yeah, they often don't feel like they fully belong anywhere. They're navigating different languages, different customs, trying to find their place in a new world.
It's got to be like super disorienting, but also I imagine it could be incredibly enriching, right? Like you're exposed to all these different ways of seeing the world.
Yeah, absolutely. It can be both challenging and rewarding.
Yeah.
And then there's the concept of the madman. You probably came across that in your readings, right?
Yeah, it's a tough one. Like the madman is someone whose perception of reality doesn't align with what society considers normal.
Right, and they often end up marginalized, ostracized because they don't fit in.
Yeah.
It's a complex form of liminality that raises all sorts of questions about how we define sanity, how we treat those who are different.
Yeah, it really makes you think about like who gets to decide what's normal and what's not. Okay, so we've talked about mythology, literature, real life examples. What about how philosophers and thinkers engage with this idea of liminality?
Yeah. Well, you mentioned existentialism and postmodernism earlier. These are These are philosophical movements that really embrace liminality.
Oh, how so?
Well, they challenge the idea that there are these like fixed essential truths about the world.
Yeah.
They're more interested in the ambiguity and the fluidity of things. Like they see liminality not as an exception, but as a fundamental part of existence.
So it's not about trying to find definitive answers, but more about like acknowledging the uncertainty.
Exactly. And, these ideas are really relevant to how we think about the digital age. Like, think about how we create these online personas, how we move between the physical world and the virtual world.
Yeah, it's like we're all becoming a little more liminal, right?
Yeah.
Like the lines between reality and virtuality, they're getting blurrier all the time.
Totally. And that can be really liberating. It allows us to experiment with different identities, to connect with people in new ways.
Yeah, there's definitely a sense of possibility there. Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the big takeaways about liminal beings? What have we learned?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that they exist in this state of constant transition, right? They defy easy categorization and they inhabit those in-between spaces. And that can be unsettling, but it's also incredibly powerful.
Yeah, they make us question our assumptions, they challenge the status quo, and as your sources point out, they can be agents of change.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And, it's not just about disruption. They also remind us that change is inevitable. It's a natural part of life.
And that even though it can be uncomfortable, it's often in those liminal spaces, those in-between moments, that the most profound growth and transformation can occur.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. And that brings us to a final thought for our listeners. Take a look around you. Where do you see liminality at play? In your own life, in your community, in the world at large? What transformations are happening in those seemingly ambiguous zones? It's a question worth pondering.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. Until next time, keep exploring.